Deprimoke arrived on a Tuesday morning with a leather portfolio and the kind of confidence that didn't announce itself. He didn't knock on Helen's office door so much as appear in it, already holding her schedule for the next 3 weeks and a corrected version of the quarterly budget she'd been wrestling with since dawn. "Miss Taylor," he said, extending his hand. "I reviewed the files last night. I think there's a reconciliation error in column J that's throwing off your projections." He was right. Of course he was right. Helen prided herself on catching every detail, but Desprez had found the mistake in hours. She studied him as he settled into the chair across from her desk. Sharp jawline, steady gaze, that infuriatingly calm smile. He looked like someone who'd never doubted himself a day in his life. "Efficient," she said coolly. "Let's see if you can maintain that standard." "I intend to exceed it." The first 2 weeks proved he wasn't bluffing. Desprez reorganized her filing system, streamlined her meeting prep, and somehow always had her coffee ready before she asked for it. He was professional, precise, and completely unreadable. Helen began to rely on his presence in ways that made her uncomfortable. Then came the board presentation. Helen stood before 12 executives, mid-sentence about projected growth margins, when her mind went blank. The numbers she'd memorized for days simply vanished. She felt sweat prickling at her collar, saw confusion rippling across the board members' faces. "Which aligns perfectly." Desprez's voice came smoothly from behind her, with the Q3 performance metrics on page 7. "Ms. Taylor and I identified a 15% increase in operational efficiency that supports these projections." He'd stepped forward just enough to redirect attention, then stepped back, letting her reclaim control. The presentation continued flawlessly. No one noticed her stumble except the two of them. "You didn't have to do that," Helen said afterward in the hallway, her voice sharper than she intended. "I know." Desprez leaned against the wall, his blue sweater making his eyes look almost impossibly warm. "But I wanted to." "You're brilliant, Miss Taylor. Everyone has a moment. That doesn't diminish everything you've built here." The compliment settled somewhere dangerous in her chest. Helen had received plenty of professional praise before, but this felt different. Personal. Like he saw past her title to the woman exhausted beneath it. "Thank you," she managed. "Anytime." 3 nights later, they were the last ones in the office. Helen had insisted on finishing the Morrison report draft herself, but Desprez had simply stayed, working quietly at the conference table while she paced and typed and paced again. "You don't have to be here," she said around 11. "I know, but I am." The building's silence wrapped around them, intimate and electric. Helen reached across the table for a folder at the same moment Desprez did. Their hands collided, and instead of pulling away immediately, they both froze. His fingers were warm against hers. She could feel her pulse in her throat. "Helen," he said softly, using her first name for the first time. She pulled back, but not quickly enough to hide the flush creeping up her neck. "It's late. We should both go home." "If that's what you want." It wasn't what she wanted. That was the problem. Somewhere in 2 weeks, Deprimoke had become more than an assistant. He'd become a presence she looked for, a voice that steadied her, a warmth that her carefully constructed life had been missing. And Helen Taylor, who'd built her entire career on maintaining distance, suddenly felt terrifyingly close to someone. The comment came during lunch in the break room, casual and cutting. "Helen, you should come to the holiday mixer. Actually talk to people instead of hiding in spreadsheets." Laughter rippled around the table. Helen smiled tightly, said something noncommittal, and left her sandwich half-eaten. She was back at her desk, staring at her screen without seeing it, when Desprez appeared in her doorway with 2 cups of coffee. "You didn't eat," he said. "I wasn't hungry." He set one cup on her desk and leaned against the doorframe, studying her with that unnerving perception he seemed to possess. Why do you do that? Do what? Keep everyone at arm's length. It's not just professionalism, Helen. It's architecture. You've built walls so high no one can even see you anymore. Helen's jaw tightened. Maybe I like the view from up here. Or maybe someone made you feel like being visible was dangerous. The observation landed with unexpected precision. Helen looked at him, really looked, and saw only genuine curiosity. Not judgment. Not manipulation. Just interest in understanding her. When I was 26, she said slowly, I dated a colleague, Marcus. He was charming, ambitious, always asking about my projects, about the clients I was wooing, the proposals I was developing. She picked up the coffee, letting the warmth ground her. 6 months in, I found out he'd been feeding everything I told him to his mentor, using my strategy, my research, my contacts to advance his own career. When I confronted him, he laughed, said I should be flattered he found me useful. Dupree's expression darkened. That's not love. That's theft. No. But it taught me something important. Helen met his eyes. People don't want you. They want what you can give them. Your connections, your influence, your access. So I stopped giving anything. I buried myself in work because work doesn't pretend to care about you. It's honest about what it takes. The office felt smaller suddenly, the space between them charged with something raw. I understand that, Dupree said quietly. He moved to the chair across from her, sitting forward with his hands clasped. More than you might think. Do you? I grew up in foster care. 7 different homes before I aged out at 18. His voice carried a practiced smoothness, but underneath it ran something that sounded like old pain. You learn fast that attachment is temporary. That people take you in because of the check, the tax benefit, the appearance of charity. Not because they actually want you. Helen felt something shift in her chest. That's why you're so self-sufficient. That's why I recognize another person who learned to survive alone. He held her gaze. You're not cold, Helen. You're careful. There's a difference. She'd heard 100 compliments about her competence, her intelligence, her drive. But no one had ever called her careful with such understanding, such lack of judgment. I'm tired of being careful, she admitted, the words escaping before she could stop them. Then don't be. Not with me. The declaration hung between them, loaded with promise and danger. Helen knew she should deflect, should rebuild the boundary she'd just let crumble. But Dupree was looking at her like she wasn't a boss or a competitor or a resource to exploit. He was looking at her like she was simply a person worth knowing. I don't know how to do this, she said. Do what? Trust someone. Dupree smiled, and for the first time since Marcus, Helen felt like maybe trust wasn't the stupidest thing in the world. Maybe it was just a risk worth taking with the right person. Then we'll figure it out together, he said. And God help her. Helen believed him. Dupree learned her patterns with surgical precision. Helen's coffee appeared on her desk at exactly 7:45 every morning. 2 shots of espresso. Oat milk, no sugar. Her files were reorganized by project priority before she opened her laptop. He remembered that she hated fluorescent lighting during late work sessions and always dimmed the overheads without being asked. How do you do that? She asked one morning, gesturing at the perfectly arranged documents on her desk. Do what? Know what I need before I need it. Dupree smiled from the doorway. I pay attention. You're not as mysterious as you think, Helen. But she felt mysterious to herself lately. The woman who'd sworn off dependency was beginning to shape her days around someone else's presence. The Morrison report became everything. 3 months of research, projections, and strategic recommendations that could position Helen for senior vice president. The deadline accelerated unexpectedly when the board moved their review meeting up 2 weeks. Helen's calendar turned into a war zone of 18-hour days and mounting pressure. You need to delegate some of this, Dupree said, watching her frantically cross-reference data sets at 9 p.m. To who? Everyone else has their own projects. To me? Helen looked up, exhausted. You're already doing twice what an assistant should handle. Then stop thinking of me as an assistant. He pulled a chair beside hers, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with coffee. Let me actually help you. Not fetch documents or schedule meetings. Real help. With the analysis, the projections, the strategy. Dupree, this is sensitive material. If anything leaked, it won't. His voice was steady, certain. You know me, Helen. You know I wouldn't betray your trust. The thing was, she did know him. Or, at least she believed she did. In 6 weeks, Dupree Moak had become the most reliable constant in her life. More reliable than her own family, more present than any friend she'd maintained. The Morrison report could make or break my career, she said quietly. I know. If I give you access to these files, I'm putting everything in your hands. I know that too. Dupree leaned closer, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. And I promise you, Helen, I will protect this project like it's my own. Because your success matters to me. You matter to me. Helen felt the last of her resistance crumbling. She was so tired. Tired of carrying everything alone. Tired of suspecting everyone. Tired of the fortress she'd built becoming a prison. Okay, she whispered. Okay. Help me. Really help me. The relief in his expression looked genuine. He pulled his laptop over and Helen walked him through the security protocols, watching her passwords and access codes appear on his screen. Each keystroke felt like shedding armor. They worked until 3 a.m. Somewhere around midnight, Helen made an error in a formula that resulted in a projection of negative $47 billion. They both stared at the screen for a beat before dissolving into exhausted laughter. Well, that's one way to get the board's attention, Dupree said, wiping his eyes. Catastrophic fiscal collapse. Very on-brand for me. Their shoulders touched as they leaned over the same monitor, and neither moved away. The office had transformed into something else entirely, not a workplace, but a sanctuary. A place where Helen didn't have to perform strength or competence, where she could just be tired and human and understood. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For staying. For caring. Dupree's hand found hers on the desk. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. And Helen Taylor, who'd spent a decade building walls, let someone finally walk through the door. The email arrived at 6 a.m. with the subject line, Mandatory Security Briefing. Attend immediately. Helen's stomach dropped before she'd even opened it. She was in the conference room by 6:30, facing 3 people from corporate security and her direct supervisor, Richard, whose expression told her everything she needed to know. "Miss Taylor, we need to discuss a breach," the lead investigator said, opening his laptop. "We've been monitoring unusual access patterns in your department for the past 3 weeks." The screen flickered to life. Surveillance footage, time-stamped 11:47 p.m., showed Dupree at her computer. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, navigating through folders Helen recognized instantly: confidential client lists, proprietary research, the complete Morrison report. "That's my workstation," Helen heard herself say.
"Yes."
"Using your credentials." Another clip appeared. Dupree, earlier in the day, watching her type her password. The angle made it clear he'd positioned himself deliberately. "We've traced 17 separate instances of unauthorized data extraction, all linked to your access codes." Helen's hands were shaking. "I didn't know. I trusted him with the Morrison files, but I didn't authorize." "You gave an assistant full access to classified material?" Richard's voice was ice. "What were you thinking?" "He was helping me meet the deadline." The words died in her throat. How could she explain that she believed in Dupree's sincerity? That she'd thought she was finally safe with someone? The investigator pulled up more evidence. A grid of files, dates, times. Each one corresponded to a conversation she'd had with Dupree, a password she'd entered in his presence, a moment of trust she'd extended. The pattern was surgical, methodical. "Dupree Moak isn't even his real name," the investigator said. "We believe he's been operating as a freelance industrial spy for at least 5 years. Your competitors paid him to infiltrate this company specifically to access your work." The room tilted. Helen gripped the edge of the table, trying to breathe through the nauseating realization that every conversation, every shared confidence, every moment she'd thought was real had been a performance. He'd studied her loneliness like a blueprint and exploited it with precision. "Where is he now?" she managed.
"Gone."
"Disappeared the night he completed the final transfer. We have warrants out, but..." The investigator closed his laptop. "Miss Taylor, we need to determine the extent of your involvement." "My involvement?" Helen's voice cracked. "I'm the victim here. You're the access point," Richard said coldly. "Your judgment compromised this entire division." The meeting ended with Helen suspended pending investigation. She walked back to her office through a gauntlet of stairs. Conversations stopped as she passed. Karen from accounting physically turned away. Marcus, the same Marcus who'd used her years ago, smirked from his cubicle like he'd always known she'd crash eventually. Her office felt like a crime scene. Dupree's handwriting on sticky notes, the coffee mug he'd used yesterday still sitting on the corner of her desk, his blue sweater draped over the guest chair. Evidence of a ghost. Helen sank into her seat and pulled up his personnel file on her computer. The photo stared back at her, that confident smile, those warm eyes that had promised understanding. Everything about him had been a lie, and she'd handed him the keys to destroy her. Her phone buzzed. 47 missed calls to Dupree's number, all unanswered. She'd been so certain something had happened to him, that he was in trouble, needed her help. The truth was so much worse. He didn't need help. He'd gotten exactly what he came for.